Can I also acknowledge all of my parliamentary colleagues, in particular the Shadow Treasurer Dean Nolder, who's here representing the Liberal Party. Can I thank Paula Rogers, John Langalont, federal MPs, all of you. You're here, you've all been named, including those Vice-Chancellors that I won't name, in case we miss out another one, but thank you all for coming. What I thought I would do this morning is, I've got a presentation that is long. I won't go through it all. I'll focus on a couple of things because I know ultimately we'll hopefully get to some Q&A, because ultimately that's what I think people are interested in. But as the Premier pointed out, the ERC process has been extensive over the last 6 months, and it's been dominated by, in particular, a keen focus on the spending side of government. That is what I've focused on as Treasurer, effectively taking hold of that sandwich and chewing it furiously to try and get spending on a more sustainable footing. You'll see as well, ultimately trying to create the space for our election commitments and, as the Premier pointed out, getting us back onto a path to a surplus position, and which we are projected to do. So I apologise if some of the slides are quick, but I just think I'll try and focus on the more important points. This is the story we're all familiar with, and I just want to highlight this is the GSP growth over since 2007. I want to highlight the red for those sitting up the back. Highlight the red. That is the business investment. That is really what you can see what's happened there over the last few years. Business investment back in 2011-12, WA had GSP growth of 9%, the largest growth of any state in the nation since records began. So we really had, driven by the red, the business investment period of the mining construction period, and then as you can see there, in respect of the coming off of that business investment, which I'm pleased to say we're about 90% of the way through, and you'll see across the forward estimates that Treasury expect business investment to start to climb again across the forward estimates, which is very important. So we're looking at 16-17 GSP growth of around about 0.25% before coming back to 3% in 17-18, driven primarily by net exports. We are now exporting a lot of iron ore, a lot of LNG, and that's really driving GSP growth. But I'll have some comments to make about what makes up that. Now, general government revenue, again, a story that you're familiar with. I won't dwell on it, but it obviously highlights the decline in revenue that we have experienced of late. Now, GST, I wouldn't be a WA Treasurer without spending a little bit of time on this. The subsidy this year is about $4.4 billion to the other states, but you can see there in respect of the red line that we are actually expected to increase GST across the forward estimates. This is important for a long period of time, and this is really what bedeviled the former government, particularly during the second term, to be fair to them, was that the crunch of reducing own source revenue, taxation revenue, was then exacerbated by GST and the lag in GST to recognise the modern economic times that we're in WA. And for example, we are still being penalised in WA for peak iron ore from 2013-14. That data still drives our GST share, which is a ludicrous position to find ourselves in. But that, for the credit rating agencies, that is actually, ironically enough, a position of strength for the state government, the fact that GST is returning. The story of the finances is this. If I was to summarise it into one graph, it's this. And that's really the period from 07-08 through to 13 was where the structural imbalance that we have in the finances was created, and that's what we're now trying to address. And so in the 4 years up until 2016-17, recurrent expenditure increased by $4.2 billion, while revenue increased by $900 million. So you can see the problem that we've now got that we have to address. Now, as Treasurer and as state government, a lot of your spend is driven by demand, people presenting to hospitals, etc. You can't simply, as I've said to a number of media outlets, you can't, as Treasurer, come in and burn the place down trying to shove yourself back into a surplus, but you do have to be very careful with how you go about finding savings, particularly when you're trying to support an economy that is now moving in the way we want it to go. The deficits that we've had have been around for a while, and there are two figures here. The red line graph is effectively the total public sector. We actually haven't had a cash surplus in the total public sector, which also includes all the capital spend. We haven't had a cash surplus there since about 2006-7, when Eric Ripper was last Treasurer. And I note he's here this morning gloating about his time with lots of surpluses, as he tends to haunt me and follow me around to these sorts of functions. Can I also note the grey graphs, which is where we are now of basically the operating account, where we're looking now in respect of our deficits. $3 billion for 16-17, but as data comes in, as we're working on the annual report now, that's likely, thankfully, to come in lower than that, around about $2.5 billion, which is helpful, but that is still data still coming in respect of that. And this has been, I guess, perhaps my, if I had a stock standard speech in the Parliament over the last decade, this is it. It's the makeup of it's the makeup of the net debt that we have, and you'll see there the red. Again, for those who can't read it, the red is really the story. It's the debt being held in the general government sector. Total public sector net debt, which is the total graph, includes all that debt that's being held in our utilities. They manage that debt generally on a commercial basis. We all pay for that when we get our bills, etc., when we actually use the services provided by those utilities. But the red is the net debt in the general government sector. That is the debt that at the moment, because of our operating deficits, we are now borrowing to fund salaries, etc., but also the debt that's gone into funding infrastructure in the general government sector. For example, schools and hospitals, of course. In respect, you build a hospital, you've got to fill it full of people, and well, in most hospitals, you've got to fill them full of people and staff to ensure that they actually operate. So you're borrowing to create further current pressures. So that is really the story of our net debt. That is, and what you'll see in a minute, what we have changed is our fiscal targets to recognise that we've got to reduce the percentage of net debt being held by the general government sector. Again, a story you're familiar with, $5 billion in revenue write-downs since the pre-election financial projection statement. That's the makeup of it. We were tracking at around $2.2 billion in respect of royalty write-downs, but there has been some very good outcomes, well, some delightful outcomes in respect of the higher iron ore price of late, and long may it rain. But you can see where we are now, and this is really what we've had to react to as a government in respect of the tax increases that we've announced. It's not something that either the Premier or I wanted to do in particular, but in state government, your levers are limited, they are blunt, and they are despised. So what we have tried to do is to make them as limited, as targeted as we possibly can, to try and ensure that we do two things. One, protect the growth in jobs, but also support the economic growth that we're expecting across the forward estimates. And in respect of GST grants, this slide is busy, but I just want to point this out. You'll recall about 10 days before a budget cut-off date, the census data flowed through into our Gst Expectations, and this was a result of updated figures from last year's census. What that highlighted was that whilst the national population had increased by about 80,000 people, WA's had, in one of the biggest changes since records were taken, had shrunk more than the ABS had expected by about 60,000 people. And what that did was, and this doesn't sound dramatic, but what it did was reduce WA's population share from 10.85% to 10.57%. Doesn't sound dramatic, but as a result, we've lost about another $2 billion across the forward estimates. This is about 10 days before budget cut-off, primarily driven by the fact that as a result that our revenue didn't change, revenue per head of population obviously increased. Therefore, the Commonwealth Grants Commission assume that you've got the capacity to raise more revenue per person, so therefore don't need any more GST. We tried to get some delay to that, but we couldn't. And I bought that in a book, and 80% of the increase in net debt in the budget is that, because we actually managed to deal with most of the write-downs up until that point. Again, apologies, a busy graph, but I want to draw your attention to the graph on the left in particular. The red in the graph on the left highlights the fact that we're expecting across the forward estimates that household consumption to take a bigger part of economic growth. This is really important, hence the decisions we've made. And I note there has been some critique that perhaps we could have gone tougher in this budget, and we could have. There is no doubt about that. But I want to be able to encourage that confidence, that household spending capacity, because ultimately that's becoming a bigger part of economic growth across the forward estimates. And the graph on the right there, the red line, is state final demand, our domestic economy after 5 years of contraction. 5 years of contraction, our domestic economy expected to pick up and start growing again in 2018-19. And these are, again, employment figures. We're expecting employment growth of about 1.5% in 17-18. Important figures. Those who watch confidence figures in particular will be pleased to see this. Around 20,000 jobs expected to be created in 2017-18. Now, turning to the budget, obviously the Premier has pointed this out. The focus has been, without trying to do too much or doing too much damage to the broader economy, how do we get the finances back onto a more sustainable setting? Reforming and controlling expenditure. 80% of my time in the last 6 months has been on that second bullet point. What we can control, we must control, and that is spend. Our revenue, to a large degree, is out of the control of a state government, particularly when you are vulnerable to the movements of international commodity prices, but what we can do is control our spend. The machinery of government changes have been large, they've been dramatic, but they've been necessary. And the budget has announced a range of further measures to really finalise that over the coming 12 months so that they not just more efficient services, but also a public sector that is more sustainable. Our public sector, our numbers of departments, compared to all the other states in the nation, is large, and we're having to deal with that. And of course, the focus on delivering on election commitments. Again, sorry about, looking up the back, I can't read a word of that, so I'm sorry. I'm sorry for you all, but what it does tell is an important story, is that a return to surplus at the moment is expected for 2020-2021. I watched both Wayne Swan and Joe Hockey celebrate their paths to surplus. So I do warn all in this room that there is a $1.3 billion surplus after $120 billion worth of spend over 4 years, and all the vagaries that come with that. It is an assumption. It is an assumption that I intend to achieve, but one that along the way events will happen that will make that difficult. But what you will see in respect of that, and this is what I do expect to happen, is that the net operating deficit to reduce each year across those forward estimates until we get there. The one that I'm particularly proud of, and again, this is going to be the effort around this is going to be in the delivery, is in respect of spend growth. We have accommodated $3.7 billion of election commitments in the budget and forward estimates, but limited spend growth, underlying spending growth to 2.4%. The 3.7% accommodates two extra factors, one being the one-off cost this financial year for the 3,000 redundancies, and the fact that with machinery of government changes, the Rottnest Island Authority and the Housing Authority have come back into the general government sector, so that their expense has now been accommodated in that. But you can see there, on average, 1.9% expense growth across the forward estimates. Ambitious, bold, will be difficult to achieve, but that is how we return to surplus. Sorry about this, you can't read any of that. But the final point is really just the four fiscal targets that we've got now. We've changed those, but the fourth one is ensuring that we reduce the percentage of general government debt, of total public sector debt held by the general government sector. An important measure, because it's really that where we've borrowed to fund salaries and non-income generating assets that we have to get under control. And this again is, I don't want to labour the point, but this is something that really the ERC has spent the majority of its time on. We couldn't come in and simply layer over the top of the spending patterns of the PFPS our election priorities. We had to find room to do that. So as a result, we're expecting 1.9% expense growth across the forward estimates average. You'll see there a contraction in expense growth in 18-19. A lot of that will be dependent upon the delivery, for example, of the redundancy program this financial year. So there are a few ifs there, but you can see we've had a big impact on spending growth, and what the budget does accommodate is a range of provisions for election commitments that we're still working on for announcements in next budget. So I'm hoping that they'll be delivered within that envelope. So who's doing the effort? Who's making the effort for budget repair? Clearly, as you can see there, the red, the government is doing, the public sector is doing the majority. Half of budget repair is around spending restraint. The wages policy that we've already announced, redundancies that we announced in the budget, and a range of other smaller measures. That is the vast majority. Of course, the announcements we've made around the payroll tax and gold, and I'll come to that in a minute, expected to make up 28% of that. GTEs, there's a range of decisions we've made around our utilities, 13%. Households, which I've already made those announcements earlier this year around the tariff reform and significant changes to seniors cards, etc. And then some smaller contributions around a point of consumption wagering tax, helpful to the finances, but to be frank, that's actually a better reform for the industry and something that we need to do. That has been agreed by all the treasurers in the nation in concert with Scott Morrison as well. So we're all moving to that, for that to start on 1 January 2019. So just quickly, the public sector, as I've said, doing most of the work in respect of budget repair. The one thing I'll focus on, of course, is yesterday's announcement that we're going to reduce the public sector by 3,000 FTEs. Now, the priority is obviously going to be given to those agencies that have been impacted on by machinery of government changes. We now have, obviously, as a result of those changes, significant duplication that we need to deal with. But what we're doing as a result is not simply allowing a Treasury to come in and harvest those savings, and believe me, I'm more than willing for Treasury to do these things. But we have to be a little bit more sophisticated, as we have been with our revenue measures. And so 20% of all savings will be captured by those agencies to reinvest in their workforce, with particular focus on digital transformation and renewing their own skill sets as well. And that will ensure that we have a public service that is really changing and adapting to the demands of how people access services, which is changing quite dramatically at the moment. And the final point there, removing indexation for non-salaries expenditure, that's one that the ministers are delighted by, I assure you of that. Really just trying to constrain their discretionary spend over the forward estimates. And finally, also up there as Finance Minister, I now own, or I'm in charge of, a lot of empty space in the CBD that we can do something with. GTEs, again, I'll be quick with these. We're setting effectively an efficiency dividend target for the GTEs to deliver some net debt targets for government across the forward estimates, and mainly with the energy utilities that currently have a payout ratio of 65%, increasing that to 75% in line with other utilities. We're not touching water. Water has a very high dividend payout ratio and gives a lot to the government. And finally, I'm abolishing the Synergies Subsidy, the tariff adjustment payment from 1819. As a result of what we did with tariff reform earlier this year, the TAP, the tariff adjustment payment, the subsidy is expected to reduce from about $150 million this year to $50 million in 1819. With revenue of $3.1 billion, I'm expecting that Synergy can also do some of that work as well. They've made a lot of efficiencies, they've done a very good job, but that final $50 million, I'm not going to impose on Synergy customers. I'm going to ask Synergy to do that last piece of work. And as Synergy was sitting on a reasonably large cash balance, I'm harvesting a special dividend, as is my want. Now, payroll tax. Payroll tax for those, and I understand the disappointment. I in particular are disappointed about this because I was very, very keen to not have to resort to revenue measures. But what we did, and the Premier and I spent a lot of time on this in this space, because payroll tax is, as I've said, it's one of the few levers we had that is despised, and I appreciate why it is so. But what we wanted to do, and I was determined around this, to limit its application to 5 years. I don't want any government, whether it be the current Labor government I'm a part of or a future government, to rely on that revenue and therefore book it in and allocate it to spend. I want this to be something that is very limited to the next 3 to 5 years, which is really the trouble that we're in, is the next 3 to 5 years, and payroll tax is a tax that is not redistributed to other states. So what we've done, we've got two thresholds: employers with payroll between 100 million and 1.5 billion. So to give you an idea, the 100 million is on average around about 1,100 employees will face a marginal tax rate of 6%, up from 5.5%, and above 1.5 billion from 6 to up to 6.5%. I appreciate that does place us at the higher end for those payroll, but focusing this on the 0.5% of the WA's largest corporations, limiting its application to 5 years, I'm confident will have a negligible impact on employment. And it's really just simply saying, without these other levers, without using these other levers, then I'm left with cutting further into the public sector, and I probably can't do too much more of that at the moment, or simply looking into the household budget. So it's not something I'm delighted by, but something that we've had to do. And similarly, again, changes to the gold sector as well in respect of royalties. This flowed out of a lot of work that was done. It's not a critique, but a lot of work was done by the former government in respect of gold royalty rate, a range of different royalty rates. But again, something that we wanted to do to recognise the risk taken by those who invest in the mining sector was to tier it. And that is, once gold is above $1,200 Australian dollars an ounce, the royalty rate will move from 2.5 to 3.75%, as suggested by the mineral review of a couple of years ago. And that, at the current gold price of over $1,600 an ounce, it's about an extra $20 an ounce that'll be harvested by the broader taxpayers in respect of that, effective from 1 January of next year. So you can see, I think what we've done with payroll and with royalties, something a bit different than previous governments have done. We've tried to be a bit more surgical in respect of the blunt instruments that we have at a state government to try and ensure that we do, one, in respect of payroll, limit its application in time period and scale, and secondly, in respect of gold, to protect the sector from downside risk in respect of the price coming off. Debt repayment account, again, announced during the election campaign, just to capture the windfalls along the way so they don't become just captured and spent, which often happens. There's been a couple of things already significant in terms of, we're talking about $340 million, so in terms of the debt levels, still small, but something important. I expect that to grow across the forward estimates. There have been a range of cost pressures that I've inherited that I've had to deal with. I want to make some comments around corrective services. Generally, corrective services is, and there has been a significant increase in the prisoners on remand that has driven a huge spend, and we've had to allocate nearly $200 million immediately about this. This is the problem we confronted. The red graph you can see there is effectively debts outstanding for the Department of Corrective Services at the end of each financial year of the last 4 years, the grey being cash that they've held. So we've had to deal with this problem in the Department of Corrective Services. If it was a private sector organisation, administrators would have been appointed around about 2013. So we've had to deal with this issue as well. Reforming expenditure, you're familiar with a lot of the decisions we've made around the service priority review, and a review also being undertaken by John Langalont for us, and the sustainable health review as well. That is going to be very important to the sustainability of the budget. I want to, if I can, conclude broadly on something that I'm really proud of, the justice pipeline model. For those who are in the space of corrective services, this is very important. Treasury and the Department of Corrective Services have been doing a lot of work, and we've allocated a small amount of money for this work to continue. Every election, you have seen it, where political parties go to an election campaign promising to employ X hundred new police officers, promising to increase the terms of imprisonment for whatever offences. They are often politically attractive and easy things to do. But what we don't really understand, and what governments have gotten away with, is really not then budgeting for the consequences of those decisions. What this is all about is ensuring that governments, when they make decisions around employing new police officers or increasing terms of imprisonment, you now will have a clear understanding of the budgetary impact on the courts, on the DPP, on legal aid, on all areas, pressures along the way, so that you can't simply fill one end with police and then unfund the rest of the justice pipeline. This is a very important piece of work, and one that I'm really, really pleased that Treasury and the Department of Corrective Services have been undertaking, and will be very important. So, all that reprioritisation, the work around expenditure has meant that we've managed to fund 83% of our $3.7 billion election priorities by reprioritisation. That's why we've been able to keep expense growth, and the challenge will be in the delivery at such a low level. This is now where I get to all the kind of pearls that we're spending on. So I'm going to whip through this, and then Trace can get up and ask, and we can do some questions. So Metronet, $1.3 billion in respect to Metronet, a big, important transformation of the public transport system, very large job creator as well. A range of election commitments around diversification of the economy, creating a new industries fund to help with that. Again, we had a big commitment around meth. This is something that we are very, very determined to tackle, because all state governments, but in particular in Western Australia, are having particular challenges with what methamphetamines is doing to our community, and that's something that we've funded fully in this budget. Similarly with education, one of our commitments was in respect of education assistants and Aboriginal and Islander education officers, delivering on that in this budget as well. Now, royalties for regions, this is a controversial space, I understand it, but I want to make a couple of points in respect of this. The budget has $4 billion worth of projects and programs funded by royalties for regions, $4 billion, off the back of $7.1 billion spent over the period of the previous government. But as the former Treasurer Eric Ripper used to describe these things, the jam jar economics approach to the finances has to end. And what that means is you can't simply consider revenue sources to a state government in isolation. Every Western Australian knows what happens to our royalties. 90% of our royalties are iron ore, 90% of those royalties are redistributed to the other states. So what that has meant is, by and large, the majority, about 80% of royalties for regions, is borrowed money. In 15-16 alone, 100% of royalties for regions was borrowed money because of the delay impacts on the GST and what iron ore was doing. 100%. That means that that model of spend under royalties for regionals was sustainable for a period of time when the balance sheet didn't carry a lot of debt. It now carries a lot of debt. So what we've done, royalties for regions hasn't changed, but we have put $861 million of regional programs, very much regional programs that were previously funded from the consolidated account, will now be funded by royalties for regions. That makes royalties for regions sustainable. It means it can actually stick around as opposed to being abolished, because that's, if you just keep it going the way it is, then the debt was just simply going to increase. And those things that were put into, from the consolidated account into R4R include, as I'll Tracy lurking there, the patient assistant transport scheme, remote essential services. You'll recall the federal government walked away from their responsibility a couple of years ago. We're funding that from royalties for regions, and the country water subsidy as well. So very much regional spends to put royalties for regions on a much more sustainable footing. So hopefully that's done, but as you can see, I think we have made decisions that are fair and balanced and are looking more broadly in a way that we can be, with our blunt levers, as sophisticated as possible, to look to all sectors of the community to try and help us through the next 3 to 5 years, because that's really the problematic times. And my focus will be over the coming years in ensuring that the spending growth assumptions are actually delivered, because if there's only one way to reduce net debt, and that's return to a general government operating surplus and staying there. Thanks very much.